Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the fish and wildlife management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, and K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We're going to have a little terrestrial episode today and talk about some critters that some people like and some people probably don't like, I'd guess, Drew.
Yeah, that's for sure. We're going to talk about moles today. And moles are one of those species that they're out there in the woods, they're in the prairie. We probably see their sign all the time, but we don't pay much attention to it unless it's in the yard.
Yeah, or the golf course.
Yeah, or the golf course.
I like to complain about it there, too. So moles, I assume, well, is there just one mole in Kansas, or are there a bunch of moles? What kind of moles do we have?
Sure. There's just one species of mole in Kansas. There's 7 species in North America. Several of those are out on the West Coast, and they have really isolated ranges. The 2 most common species are the star-nosed mole and the eastern mole. Star-nosed mole from the extreme northeast part of Florida up the Atlantic coast on to like that Newfoundland area up there, and then west over to eastern Manitoba. And the eastern mole is basically it overlaps that range going up the east coast, but it's from the Great Lakes south basically, and in the Great Plains it's from like South Dakota south all the way down to South Texas, and it's distributed all the way out to western Kansas, but that's basically the western limit of its range.
Quite a distribution there. So
yeah,
lots of different habitats. If you think about a mole kind of living underneath the soil or something, that's a lot of differences going on in the habitats that they're living in. So
sure.
What are these moles? They're hanging out underneath the earth. Are they coming out to eat, or where? What are they eating on a daily basis?
Sure. So they spend almost their entire life underground. They'll come out every once in a while. Some moles probably never come above the surface of the soil. They're super adapted to be below ground. They're insectivorous. So I think a lot of times folks have the misunderstanding that they're out there eating plant material, eating roots, and those sorts of things. We do have some fossorial rodents. Fossorial is the fancy term that wildlife folks use for critters that mostly dig and spend their time below the ground. So we do have fossorial rodents that will eat plant material and damage plants that way, but moles are actually just digging through the soil. They're mainly eating earthworms, insects, insect larvae like that we would typically call grubs and that sort of thing. And, they probably, if they're digging through the ground and they come across a little skink or something like that, they wouldn't turn their nose up to eating the small vertebrate too. But mainly they're eating invertebrates.
Is that how they're finding their food? They're just kind of burrowing around and bump into something?
Sure. So they're using a couple of senses. One is smell. They find food with their nose, but they're also sensing vibrations in the soil, sensing that movement. And that's one of the things when we're talking about control. It can be really hard to come up with a delivery system for something that we want a mole to eat that it actually notices and thinks about something as food. And so that's one of the challenges. They tend to detect their prey by motion.
Yeah, kind of bumping into it or feeling that it's there and going after it or something. So if you just put some pellets in the ground that aren't wiggling around, they might not even know it's there.
Exactly.
Huh? And so you talked about these guys living, they're fossorial was the term you used, living underground. And I know when I've seen moles, they have little squinty eyes and really big, almost like shovels for their hands. But what other adaptations might they have?
Yeah, so I mean their eyes are present, but they're very, very, very small. They're covered with hair, and they use them very, very little. And so one of the adaptations is just the fact that their eyes are small and covered with hair so they don't get plugged up with stuff, right? Their ears are also very, very small. Their earlobes, which mammalogists would call pinnae, external pinnae, are really reduced. They have very small earlobes so that they don't catch all that soil in their ears. You mentioned their front feet, and you described them as shovel-shaped. I tend to describe them as scallop-shaped, but they look really funny. They're way bigger than they ought to be relative to the size of the mole. If we're thinking about most species, they almost don't have arms. It just sort of looks like these great big scallop-shaped feet sprout out of the front of their body. And I don't know. You see some pictures or caricatures on the internet of people with dinosaur arms, and moles almost have that like T-Rex type structure, except on the end of the non-existent arms, there's these big old paddles, and they've got great big claws. Of course, the one of the reasons I say scallop shaped is because teaching folks how to learn scientific names, their genus is Scalopus, and if you think about that scallop-shaped front paw, that helps. Their hind legs are also very much designed to help them dig. They've got some claws on their hind legs. They got a really short tail. One of the interesting things about their fur is there's the same amount of resistance, which is almost none, if you push it either forward or backward. And so, if you think about, let's say, a coyote with that long hair that goes backwards, if it was down in the soil and was trying to back up, that hair would get caught on everything and kind of prevent it from going backwards, or at least be uncomfortable. A mole doesn't have that. So it's got this basically the same resistance, both going forward and backward. The skull is really flat and pretty elongated, and they're sort of like shaped like a burrito almost, and really, really muscular. And when you think about how a mole moves through the soil, when they're up in that more shallow part of the soil, if there's plenty of moisture in it, or if it's a fairly loose material, they're almost like swimming through it. And so they're using those short legs with the big scallop claw or front feet to do almost like a breaststroke maybe. But they're also using their head and their body to push up that soil. And that's what creates the ridges out in our lawn that we see as mole runs. They're not always digging a tunnel. A lot of times they're just swimming through and pushing it up like that. So,
I like swimming through is a good description of kind of what they're doing. Thinking about them moving under in the soil is really an interesting idea there.
And that also fits back with their scientific name. So scallop-shaped front feet, and their specific epithets, aquaticus. So you got all kinds swim in the water.
All kinds of tricks to learn this. So Scalopus aquaticus. I don't have an excuse not to remember that after all these tricks you've given us. So are these moles are moving around? I mean, we're familiar with the tunnels right under the surface because they're bumping up. Do they have they have big dens, or they just make all these tunnels? What does it look like if you were to go look at their house underground?
Yeah, so it's mainly just these tunnels that move through. When a female is giving birth, she would create some sort of chamber that she would give birth and have those pups in, but they probably wouldn't stay in that chamber all that long. Once they get to be probably 2 or 3 weeks old, I'd guess they're out there moving around with her. I don't know. It's hard to pay attention. But when you think about the area that a mole uses, it's not, you don't see big chambers. It's just these tunnels that they move around in. And there's a couple of kinds of tunnels, and that's important to know if you end up needing to trap them. One of the kinds would be sort of like a travel corridor, and that's where we see long, straight sections of run. They might have some twists and turns in them and curves, but the opposite of that is these feeding areas where we see run on top of run on top of run, and in a 10-foot square area, they might have the whole thing basically worked up with all these little runs. And so if you're thinking about, if moles do bother you and you're thinking about trying to control them, you don't ever know if they're going to come back to a feeding area. They may have gotten all the food that was in that spot, but they're typically going to come back through those longer, straighter runs because that's how they're moving around the area. So
they tend to stay up at the top of the soil. Is that most of the time?
It depends.
Of course it does.
Yeah. So, like right now, driving in this morning, the temperature on the dash of my pickup for the first 10 miles or so was like -15, -18, which we don't have that kind of cold very often here in Kansas.
That's chilly.
But it's pretty rough. But when it gets really cold and that surface layer of the soil either freezes or gets cold enough that the invertebrates move down to the lower part, or if it's so dry that it becomes hard to dig in that upper part of the soil, then they'll go deeper into the soil profile. So they're going to basically follow the food and the easier digging conditions. During the late spring into the early summer until it starts to really dry out, and then again in the fall, they're going to be in that top 3 or 4 inches of soil. Right now, a lot of them are probably pretty deep. They're going to be down there. We usually don't get the ground freezing below a foot, but if we did, they'd move down below that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All that makes sense. They're chasing food, and they're going to be where it's easy to move around.
Sure.
Right? So that makes a lot of sense. You briefly touched about their reproduction, and so when are these moles out there reproducing? What's that look like?
Yeah. So right now, basically January through April is going to be their breeding season, and after mating, the female's going to have like a 4 to 6 week gestation period, and then she's going to have a litter of somewhere between 3 and 5 kits or pups or whatever you call a baby mole. And she's going to raise them as long as they need to be nursed. As soon as they're able to take care of themselves, then they're going to start probably making their own tunnels and finding their own food. They might stay close by. They might not disperse a long distance until later. But if you're a person who doesn't want to have moles in your yard, then thinking about that reproductive season is kind of an important thing. So as soon as we start seeing mole activity in a turfgrass situation or a yard in the late winter or early spring, if you can trap them now, you've got one female in about an acre probably. If you wait until May or June, then you might have 5 or 6 moles in that same acre that you have to trap in order to take care of your problem. So
yeah, planning ahead and getting on top of that's important.
Sure.
Are they forming? I mean, you kind of said that they distribute fairly quickly. Are the males sticking around with the females? Are they forming families, or what's that look like?
No, the male, they're solitary, and so there's no male investment in raising the young ones. And in that acre, you might have a couple of home ranges that overlap. So there might be a male that overlaps 2 or 3 females or something like that across. The female home ranges are probably going to be situated to where they don't overlap, but then the male home range would overlap several females, and each one of them's probably going to occupy, an acre or less. If you had really high densities of moles, we're talking about like 5 in an acre. And a lot of people are astonished by that when we look at the amount of sign, the runs and stuff that they leave out there. But, moles have an incredibly high metabolism, and they got to be eaten all the time. They don't hibernate. They're active during the wintertime. And in order to get the amount of food that they need, they've got to move around a lot within that home range.
And so you said they don't hibernate. We're just not seeing signs as much this time of year because they're down deeper.
Because they're down deep. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're moving around. Is it beneficial to the soil to have them, I know my wife's obsessed with having a green lawn and she pays to go aerate it, right? Or spends a bunch of time out there. So Does a mole moving around provide benefits to this turfgrass?
It does, yeah. Really, anything that digs through the soil is going to provide some ecological services from an aeration standpoint. It also, aids with that percolation of the water down through the soil, or the infiltration rate. Other benefits of having moles out there, like we said, they eat insects and other arthropods, and so they're eating those grubs that folks don't want to have in their yard. A lot of those grubs are things like the green Asian beetles. I grew up calling them green June bugs. I know that's the green Japanese beetle or something like that. So they eat a lot of species that are pest species. The flip side of that is, if you've got a lot of grubs in your yard and you want to have a pretty yard, then it's going to take a lot of that digging activity by moles to get after those grubs. And so, it's not going to be as pretty on top.
Yeah. Do you want to have a dug up turf, or do you want to have a few fewer spots maybe from those grubs? Huh?
Yeah.
So trade off there.
There is. And being a wildlife biologist and not somebody who spends a lot of time out in my yard, when I see mole activity, and I had some even prairie voles in my yard recently, and when I see that kind of stuff out there, it doesn't bother me. It all depends. The moles being there is a natural thing, so you don't have to control them. If you like them, that's great. But if you want to have that really pretty turfgrass yard, then that's damage.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily go hand in hand, having a pretty yard with having moles. What about like if we think about a prairie, just like a native prairie?
Yep.
I assume there are moles out there digging through that kind of habitat. Do you see the same types of response that you would with the turfgrass with a regular yard?
Yes, but that digging action through the yard typically doesn't injure the plants. It's just something that we see, and unless in the prairie, it really wouldn't have any negative effects whatsoever. It's possible that if there are people walking around out in that prairie, that they might trip, because the ground's really spongy below those runs, and your toe could dig in and you could trip. And that's one of the things that when I talk to folks who have moles in their yard and who are wanting to control them, oftentimes with older folks, they're worried about tripping because of those soft spots in their yard. Yeah, but we wouldn't consider moles out in the prairie as being, they don't hurt the prairie at all. They're 100% beneficial when they're out there.
It seems to me, and I'm not a terrestrial person, so it seems like they'd be digging through a bunch of roots and ripping up stuff and causing a bunch of damage. But so I'm kind of surprised it's not negative.
Yeah, well, to an individual grass plant, I'm sure that there's some damage that it has to recover from, but they're not actually biting through those roots, or really they're just loosening them up a little bit,
nudging them out of the way.
Yeah, if you think about going and buying a potted plant, one of the things I was taught, when you go buying a potted plant, it's root bound.
Yeah.
Right? And so you need to take and break up all those roots on the outside that were next to the pot before you plant it. So a little bit of injury to the roots isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned maybe, a one mole per acre or something, one female per acre. So, maybe if you had 1,000 moles in an acre, it'd be a problem. But
sure.
But at the densities they're at, probably not so much. It's just interesting to think about. So if I'm out in my lawn and I'm worried about tripping over them, can I just step on the tunnels, and we'll bashing it back down, get them to leave that area alone?
Nope. They'll come right back through and push it right back up.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the ways to do a good job of setting traps in a place where you're going to catch them, or to place toxicants in a way that the mole's going to encounter them. If we find one of those longer, straighter sections of run and we step on the top of it and flatten it out, and we come back later and that's been pushed back up, well, we know that's an active run. That's a good place to set a trap. It's a good place to place toxicant if that's what you're wanting to try to do.
So to fix the problem, it sounds like we need to get rid of the mole. Is that right?
Well, when we think about our options, I think we talked about that acronym HER a long time ago. That stands for habitat modification, exclusion, and removal. So if we think about those options for control for moles, habitat modification is one that's recommended a lot. And the way that we would modify habitat to try and get rid of moles would be to use insecticides to kill their food. And while you can reduce grub densities in a turfgrass situation with toxicants or insecticides, you're never going to get rid of all the mole food. In Kansas, we have no registered pesticides that are labeled for earthworm control. I've been told that you can apply some of the toxicants at a heavy enough rate to kill most of the earthworms out there, but in order to do that, it's off-label. You're applying so much of it that it becomes illegal. So we can't remove all their food. You might reduce some of the mole activity by reducing grub densities, but you're not going to eliminate moles from a yard that way. So that would be the habitat modification option. Exclusion is incredibly hard. You would have to place a barrier around your yard that's deep enough that a mole can't dig under it. And if we think about moles digging under roads and digging under sidewalks and feeding underneath concrete slabs that people park on, it'd be pretty hard to put in a practical barrier around a lawn that excluded moles from that lawn.
Yeah, you'd have to get pretty deep before that was being beneficial.
Yeah.
You know what, you mentioned the worms and potentially putting enough insecticide that you're starting to kill those, but I would imagine too that if you're doing that, some of those species are providing benefits. Some of those insects are beneficial to the grass itself. So you might be causing more harm than the moles trying to get rid of everything, get rid of all their food.
Yeah, sometimes the solution's worse than whatever you're trying to get rid of.
Yeah, I think that's it. So the last part of the HER would be removal.
Yeah.
And so, I know it seems like there's 1,000 different types of traps out there, but
sure.
Where would we start if we did have a mole and removal was our best option?
Yeah, the most common thing that folks want to try when I'm talking to them about this kind of thing is toxicants, because you place it out there and then you get to forget about it, right? And there are some studies out there that show decent efficacy of toxicants, but it's almost never consistent. Charlie, my predecessor, he did a study here in Kansas where he was testing several of the different kinds of poison gummy worms. And after 3 weeks, he saw a 20% reduction in mole activity. And that was 3 applications of the toxicant over 3 weeks. And the reality is that with stuff like that, you can fool some of the moles all the time and all the moles some of the time, but you'll never fool all the moles all the time. So you learn how to trap them, or you learn how to live with them. The traps, like you said, there's a whole bunch of different options. And the reality is that they all work, and they can all work really well. They have to be set correctly. So selecting a trap that you are comfortable setting, you have the hand strength to set, and that is user-friendly for you is the most important thing. The harpoon traps that have the big spikes on them that we probably all grew up seeing, those are very effective and they catch a whole lot of moles. It may not be the best option, though, if you've got pets out in the yard or if you got young kids running around. In that instance, you might want a trap that is completely underground. And there are several different trap options that you dig up the mole run and you place the trap in the mole run and then you cover it back up. Those prevent a pet or a child or somebody who shouldn't be fooling with the trap from accessing it, but they also make it to where you have to go out and dig up the trap in order to check it. And so they're not necessarily as convenient for all the situations. What I would suggest folks do if they are thinking about getting traps, we we produced a video last year for mole control that's available on our KSRE Wildlife Management YouTube page, and it shows several different designs of traps. I would check that out, see if one of those looks like one that might work well for you. And then that same video also shows you how to identify a good place to set the trap. It shows you how to set each of the different kinds of traps that we show, and how to remove a couple of moles from traps and that sort of thing.
Yeah, very good resource that we have. I love that we're getting some of those videos up there to help people out.
Yeah.
So I know with if we go like trapping a raccoon or a beaver or something, we have to go out to that trap every day and check it, right?
Yep.
Is that same thing apply to like a mole type trap if it's a nuisance causing us a problem?
Yep. Yeah, traps should be checked every 24 hours. And, all of the mole traps are lethal designs of traps, but they don't always grab a hold of the mole in a way that kills it. Sometimes they pinch them and hang on to them by their hide if we didn't place it correctly, or if the mole was going deeper than how we set it, even if we did place it correctly for the previous run or something like that. And so, even if we're removing an animal, we always want to make sure that we're removing that animal in the most humane way as possible. So going out and checking those traps every day is important. That also brings up, what do we do with a mole after we catch it, right? So typically, if you're next to a open area, if you have a house out in the country and you're trapping moles in your yard and you own the pasture right next door, you might just toss the dead moles because there's not going to be very many of them. You might toss those over the fence and then they become a resource for some critters potentially. A scavenger might find that and eat it. But the vast majority of people, the best option is going to be to double bag that in the household trash and send it to the landfill. That would be a legal way to deal with the dead mole that you had.
Sure. So lots of different techniques there. I know that you talk to folks about catching moles, and there's some creative ways out there. So are there, these folk remedies, you hear about chewing up juicy fruit and the moles love that smell or something. Any of these crazy ideas work?
Well, you can fool some of the moles all the time, but you never fool all the moles all the time. The juicy fruit gum, I've heard that they eat it and it kills them. I've also heard that the smell repels them. That's not something that's been found to be effective. Fumigation, trying to gas moles out, whether it's with your exhaust from a vehicle or an actual commercially available fumigant that's labeled for fossorial mammals. Typically, those don't work very well for moles because of those shallow run systems. When we can easily find where the moles are, they're up in that shallow run, and the soil tends to be loose enough that any of that gas would escape out the sort of roof that's over the top of that run. So those don't work very well. One of the things that you see on YouTube a lot that looks to be pretty effective is flooding. So folks will stick a garden hose in the mole run, and then they'll watch out there for the ground to start moving, and they'll come to that spot and they'll jab a pitchfork or something like that down into the soil where they see it moving. And I don't know about you, but I really don't have time to go out in my yard and flood all the moles out so that I can jab them with a pitchfork. It's a lot more efficient to me to go out and find the active runs, set a trap and let the trap do its thing, and come back the next day and check those traps. So that's my experience with the folk remedies, and based on the research, the trapping is really your best option.
Yeah, lots of good ideas that someone's friend's uncle told them many years ago, right?
Yeah.
But actually getting that science that shows they work is a different thing. So, these moles tend to be kind of shallow. We've established that, and
they're not shallow in that they tend to like other pretty moles and shiny things and that sort of stuff. So.
Shallow in the ground.
Yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't specific enough for you, Drew. When I've seen a mole, a lot of times it's been because a dog has been digging it up and kind of, is chasing after it. And that's when you see a lot of damage. It's from something else kind of chasing that mole. But I'm wondering, I'm sure in nature that there are critters that feed off of moles, but what's the predation look like for a mole out in the wild?
It's going to be pretty low. Moles have like musk glands in their body, and they produce a really strong smell. I've seen lots of instances where coyotes, wild canids, had dug up moles, killed them, and then left them. I've seen the same thing with shrews that they caught. With shrews are also insectivores. They also have those musk glands. They're pretty stinky. So most of the mammals that we think of as potentially being predators of these critters aren't really. They kill a few, but they don't tend to eat them. But they don't probably kill enough of them to really regulate the population or anything like that. Snakes would be an effective predator of them that would eat them after they kill them. But again, I don't think it's all that common. Typically in the areas where we see lots of moles, and they tend to be there. You talked about them being up in that shallow part of the soil profile. It's important to think about what's going on with the moles relative to their environment and the different kinds of sign that we might see. So besides those shallow runs, the other kind of sign that we see is a molehill. And being able to tell the difference between a molehill and a pocket gopher mound is kind of an important thing. That way, if you've got a rodent out there that might be eating the vegetation, and how to control it versus an insectivore that's out there doing other things, and the control is going to be different for moles too. So a molehill tends to be sort of round at the base and cone shaped. If they're out there for a while, they get sort of smoothed off and flattened out, but they're always going to be that more of a mound or more of a hill rather than an area where you have this oblong area of soil that's much wider than it is tall, and that's because of how the difference basically between what moles do when they're cleaning out their runs, because they're way down deep in the soil, versus what pocket gophers do when they're cleaning out their runs. So a mole is going to push that soil up and it's going to fall over, and it's just going to keep doing that, and it may never come out of the ground while it's doing it. Whereas a pocket gopher, it's going to come out to the edge of the tunnel, and it's either going to push like a bulldozer and push soil out and then go back in the ground and push more soil out, or get sort of in the opening of that tunnel with its back end facing out and kick that soil out. So a pocket gopher mound will be flat and fairly broad, whereas a molehill tends to be shaped more like a hill. It's usually as tall or taller than it is wide.
Would you see a lot of those in one area, or is it kind of tend to be isolated?
With pocket gopher mounds, you can see a pretty high density of them in a small area. Moles are only doing that as much as they have to. So there tends to be a lot fewer molehills in a given area than there would be pocket gopher mounds.
Interesting. So if they're not being predated on a lot, right? I mean, what is controlling their populations out in the wild? Do they not have a very long lifespan, or what's happening to these moles over time?
Well, they don't live a long time, but they're also fairly restricted by having the right kind of soil conditions. And then they would also be restricted to areas that had a high enough density of their prey that made it possible for them to eat enough food to stay alive. Sure. And so, like, if we're thinking about soil conditions, they want well-drained, fairly loose soil, but that's not too loose, because then they won't be able to maintain a burrow. But it also can't be too firm, because then all they would do is dig, and they'd use all their energy digging and couldn't find enough prey. So, if you think about, kind of a loamy soil that's got a little bit of clay texture, but it's not rocky, it's not too sandy. Within a given pasture, or even within a yard, you might have that soil running as like a seam through it.
Sure.
They can be really, really common and at fairly high densities in forests where you've got that really nice soil that's got a whole lot of humus in it, a lot of old plant material breaking down that's pretty loose. That's where we tend to see a whole bunch of them. And if you've got a yard that backs up to that, then, of course, they're spilling over into your yard, and that yard, because we oftentimes bring soil into a yard so that we can create that nice lawn and that sort of thing, a lot of times we bring the right kind of soil for those critters into our yard that way.
That it's just interesting to think about, because we're talking about moles, but it keeps coming back to soil types and all the invertebrates that are there.
Sure.
So, there's a lot of other things. Getting your mind off of just the direct problem is a fun way to think about things. Might help your management a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, that was a fun talk about moles today, Drew. Lots of good information. Remember, that video is out there on our KSRE YouTube channel. Lots of other helpful resources for aquatic and terrestrial wildlife issues. So make sure you check that out. However you're getting your information, make sure you're liking us, leaving a review, and follow along for more information. So we'll see you next time on Fins, Fur, and Feathers. Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.